faith and hope in a sea of change. St. Paul was speaking into a situation that was full of change, as I'll explain to you in a minute. But change for everyone listening to me here today will be different, and the challenge of it will be different. For somebody here, the change will be a change in life circumstances brought about by loss or sickness or bereavement or loss of a friendship, and the terrible upset and turmoil that can mean. Let's listen to St. Paul, every one of us, what he said to a situation of great change. But we also think of the change that's going on in our world. People my age, people indeed much younger than me, look around us at the world we now live in, and it is so utterly different to the one into which we were born that it is completely discombobulating. And change can be very threatening. And dealing with it, as we are seeing on the level of society, can and does lead to great fracturing. If we look across the Atlantic at the political divide in the United States, there's evidence of divisions beyond anything there ever was before. And it's a kind of a headline for the rest of the world, because we're all looking in. We're all spectators, and indeed, almost in our heads, we're players in what's going on over there. And we're tempted to take sides, as everybody is. Often it can seem in society, more than ever before, that nobody believes anything that the other side says. Discourses, evermore, as we say now, toxic. Social media stirs up animosity, contempt, hatred. People say cruel and nasty things about those on the other side of an argument that would have been unthinkable to them at an earlier time before social media. Maybe we're all sucked into that. And whether it's us or them, we all justify it because of the rightness of our cause. In some ways, that same spirit can and does, certainly online, creep into discourse in the church. I think one of the really good reasons for Pope Francis talking about synodality, about being together, is that in a world where things are falling apart and where two sides face each other with complete incomprehension and indeed contempt, the message is that the followers of Jesus cannot be like that. We have to do it differently because we are the followers of Jesus. We have to walk together, to learn to listen to one another respectfully, even when we are different. We in the church, of course, have an anchor that you need when you're in the sea, in a stormy sea. Our anchor is that we as Catholics are obliged to listen to one another in the light of the Scripture and of our Catholic tradition. We're anchored and grounded in those two things. And if we really stay grounded in Scripture and our Catholic tradition, we can listen to one another and talk to one another in respectful ways, clinging to respect. I want to talk a bit about Paul. Paul was writing to the Romans. And if we think we are in a situation of division, I want you just for a minute to think of who Paul was writing to. About 10 or 15 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, there was a small community of Jews living in Rome. Some of them had heard about Jesus, the Messiah, who was risen from the dead, and they believed in him. And some of them didn't. And there was such division among them that there was upheaval in the Jewish community in Rome, so that in AD 49, the Emperor Claudius drove them all out of Rome. We think we're bad. The Jews, including the Jews who were the first believers in Jesus, were so divided, fighting among themselves so badly, that the pagan emperor put them out of the city. That left a small number of Gentiles who had also heard of Jesus risen from the dead left behind in Rome. And they got on with it, growing to know this Jesus better. 5 years later, the Jews were all allowed back, bringing with them all of their divisions. And now, in the one town again, there were the Jews who did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, the Jews who did believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and the Gentiles who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And some scholars think that already, just over that 5 years, the Gentiles who believed in Jesus, that's our predecessors, we're Gentiles who believe in Jesus, they began to look down on the Jews, letting the Jews know that they weren't really the chosen people anymore. And 5 years after that, the Emperor Nero started persecuting the Christians. Can you imagine it? We think we're bad. We think we have troubles. That was the world into which St. Paul, the world of cataclysmic change into which St. Paul was speaking when he wrote to the Romans. And he wrote a letter of such sophistication and delicacy. He expressed what faith in Christ meant in new ways that nobody had ever managed to write or think or express ever before. But he had to do it with great delicacy because of all the trouble I am talking about. So I want you to think of him talking to people dealing with phenomenal change. And listen to him. Let us listen to him as a church today, which in many ways is divided, not nearly as badly divided as they were in Rome in the 40s and 50s AD, but divided. The first thing in that letter that we heard Paul say that I want to quote was, "Do not model your behavior on the contemporary world, but be transformed in the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is." Do not be conformed to the contemporary world. Either it's ways of dealing with one another that we hear and pick up on social media that we can enter into very readily, or indeed it's rejection of our tradition and teaching and our moral tradition. Do not be conformed to the modern world. And this is for those of us who are tempted to get into the culture wars and feel and act contemptuously towards others. Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. There's a more literal translation where what Paul wrote was, "I tell everyone not to think high and mighty thoughts over and above what it is appropriate to think." Do not be conformed to the modern world, and do not think high and mighty thoughts. Even if I'm right and you're wrong, Paul says, do not think high and mighty thoughts. That is not our way. Whatever your challenge is, your change challenge, let Paul speak to you when he says, let love be without any pretense. Avoid what is evil, stick to what is good. In brotherly love, let your feelings of deep affection for one another come to expression, and regard others as more important than yourself. This is a big challenge for that situation in which you are right now. Let feelings of deep affection come to expression for the person on the other side, whatever it is, wherever it is. Be joyful in hope, persevere in hardship, keep praying regularly. Be joyful in hope, persevere, keep praying regularly. We are the followers of Jesus. We are called to a higher standard. And then just before I finish, in order to live well this synodal way in this fractured modern world that is exploding all around us, we need hope and faith. Jesus spoke about faith in the gospel. He said, if you had faith, you could say to this mountain, rise up and be thrown into the depths of the sea, and it would obey you. He says that to you. What is this faith that you and I are invited to have? It is not some kind of magic control over God to make God do what I want. We often feel that it is. Well, if I only had faith, I would get what I want. The understanding being that my faith would be some kind of magic, and God would have to give me what I want. I'd get what I want. No. Faith is a stance of complete surrender to God. Faith is a stance of surrender to God and communion with Him, just like Jesus was. So that, just as the power of God was present in Jesus, so too will it be present in us, who are His church. And if we worry about our church in a time of change, let us remember, it is the church of Jesus. And Jesus is the Son of God.